Hi, everyone. Books and Bridges welcomes you to another conversation in our series on ethical schools of thought. We endeavor to elevate our public discourse, broaden our civic inspirations, and deepen our social interactions. Tonight, we enter an ancient paradigm that nonetheless whispers in the ear of our secular modern society. We in the West still live in a civilization saturated with Christian assumptions about compassion, power, mercy, and punishment, assumptions that fuel our anxieties and forecast our hopes. But in the long genealogy of ideas, many streams contribute to many rivers. Originating centuries before Jesus, but fading out in the late Roman Empire, traces of Epicureanism found their way back into our mental orbit during the Age of Enlightenment. So much of religion and philosophy arise out of human attempts to address the unknown. How should we live in the now, knowing that death is around the corner? How can we see through the illusions of fear? Where do we find control amid the swirl of reckless passion and paralyzing worry? It is out of these perennial questions that Epicurus and later Lucretius developed a calmer, more rational way. And here to lead us through this journey is Mike Pope. Dr. Pope received his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. He is currently an associate professor of classics at Brigham Young University. His training focused on the literature of the late Roman Republic and early empire. He is especially interested in the ethics of Epicureanism and Stoicism and how these are co-opted in literature. Pope is also interested in how philosophers and poets conceptualize human bodies to exemplify notions of honor, virtue, femininity, masculinity, and morality. He has written many scholarly articles, including about early Christian literature, and is the author of the forthcoming Lucretius and the End of Masculinity by Cambridge University Press. And adding to all that brain power, I hear he's a guy who you never want to face down in the weight room. Is that right?
Yes, I do like to lift heavy things.
Yeah, that's a great balance that you bring. So I just turn the time over to you. Go ahead and give us your presentation. Tell us how you want to proceed tonight, and we'll be all ears.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation, Nathan. This is a great opportunity and something that I enjoy talking about with students or anyone else who will listen. So I'm very much looking forward to this. The way I envision the discussion going is something like this, where for the first little while, I will present ideas, but I don't want this to be a lecture and then a Q&A format. I think that it would be great if people want to start chiming in at any moment with questions or comments. That's all good to me. So don't feel like you're breaking the flow of the conversation. Don't hesitate. Don't worry if you feel like that you're just a novice in all this or you don't know anything about Epicureanism. That's all good. This is for everybody, and all questions are good questions here. Also, I can't see you, but I'll be able to perhaps hear you. Is that right, Nathan?
Probably not. Probably
Okay.
just written questions.
Okay.
Back and
Great.
forth.
So if you want to do questions through the chat function, I'll be keeping an eye on that. That's great. Or if you want to submit them through Nathan to send them to him, we'll do that. Okay, so Epicureanism. Epicureanism is, of course, it's a philosophy, and the name isn't really special. It's just an adjective and then an abstraction from a guy's name, Epicurus. Epicurus, we should know maybe a little bit about him before we start talking about some of his ideas. Everyone knows Socrates. Everyone's heard of Socrates, and probably Plato. These are great figures to begin with, to kind of get ourselves situated in time and space. So Socrates and Plato, these guys lived in Athens. The timeline between like when Socrates died and when Epicurus was born was like 55, 60 years. So it's kind of like us looking back for me back into my parents' childhood. All right, that's the time relay. Not a huge distance in time. We have Socrates, we have Plato, we have Plato's most famous student, Aristotle. And then Aristotle is an older contemporary of Epicurus. So we're in that period where philosophy was a known thing. There were multiple generations of it, and there were various schools. Our guy Epicurus, not from Athens, but he lands at Athens. He is interested in philosophy from a young age, and like other men of substance at the time, he was able to take in lectures and go to people's different schools and learn. Well, he was quite disappointed in a whole lot of people's explanations for things, and he really came to despise Plato, not personally, but some of his philosophical ideas. So he learns from others, and there is a theory that he's quite taken by. And this is the theory that there are these invisible to the eye atoms. All right. He did not create the theory of atoms. He inherited it from others. People had already been theorizing this beforehand for a few generations. The word atom, we can kind of hear it. Ah, meaning not, and then tom, well, that's a little bit harder, but cut. Let's see, still a little bit of fading in and out. Let me try it a little closer. Is that better?
Yeah, so far. Just keep going.
Okay.
We'll see.
We'll see how this goes. I just didn't want to breathe too heavily into the microphone. So these atoms, the name means not cut. All right. Well, so how did people way back when figure out that there could be these primal elements? We have to understand that although people 2,400 years ago were lacking in the instruments that we have, they were quite capable of thinking up scenarios in their minds to prove things. And these people of substance and time, it takes a great bit of leisure to think about these things. They were able to think their way into an idea of an uncuttable primal substance. Okay, so we have atoms. Epicurus hears the theory and he takes it. And he takes it for a different purpose. The atomists that preceded him were mostly interested in physics. All right, how does the world come to be? How do we explain nature? Epicurus was interested in all that for sure, but he was also interested in what do we do with that information? Empiricism is the kind of approach to life where you observe things and then you make notes and then you try to explain these things with evidence that you cull from your senses and then from your intellect. As an empiricist, Epicurus was not just interested in how the world is, but what do we do in the world? All right. And so he is highly invested in ethics. Now, the period that he is living in is a period that's rather not at ease. Athens is no longer the seat of power. Culture, yes, in the Greek-speaking world, but it had lost its empire. By the time we get to this period, Alexander the Great had come down, or his father had come down and taken over Greece and used its soldiers to march eastward all the way to India. The world has been fundamentally changed. And there's some crises in confidence and crises in understanding one's position in the world. And to oversimplify it, it's at this moment where we have some competing ideas about life coming to be. We have Epicurus. We have people who are going to be called the Stoics. We have skeptics, and these aren't lowercase s skeptics, people who distrust whatever. These are uppercase skeptics. These are people who are investigating intensely everything. We also have cynics. Cynics means literally dog people. And then we have an unfortunate adjective nowadays, to be cynical. It doesn't really quite fit what it meant in antiquity. But we have these various groups, and they're trying to explain people's place in the world and deal with the anxieties of a universe that is suddenly bigger than a city, and it's bigger than an empire. And the world's a lot bigger than it was, but then the world feels a lot smaller because people are starting to look outward and they're starting to theorize about stars and planets. And people feel unmoored. All right, so Epicurus is in this era. It's an era of anxiety. Well, with physics, our guy, Epicurus, wants to know what to do. So let's talk about these physics first. When I say atom, we need to be quite careful of what Epicurus had in mind versus what we think. We have this, the periodic table of elements. Well, there's like 94 that occur in nature and maybe a couple dozen that we can recreate in laboratory situations. This is not what Epicurus had in mind. It was quite rudimentary, the idea of atom. Think of it as something like small, all right? You can't see it. These things were quite small, can't see them, and there probably wasn't a really good idea about subatomic particles. Like nowadays, we think just regularly of electrons, protons, neutrons, and even further down the scale, quarks and leptons and so forth. That was not what Epicurus was thinking. All right, so there were atoms and they couldn't be cut. So it's hard to think of subatomic particles. On the other hand, there was a concept that these atoms had to be finite in variety. Now, if you kind of let that simmer for a moment, why would they, through just thinking through the question, why would they come up with finite in variety? Well, it's because if we have an infinite variety of atoms, can we ever actually come to be? Can anything actually exist? So if you had an infinite periodic table, there'd be no limits to anything, and it'd be hard for something to come to be. So Epicurus posited that there were infinite numbers of atoms, but a finite variety. All right, and by setting those bounds, that's how we can explain why things exist. But atoms are not the only thing. Now, the next thing we talk about is actually difficult to use language for. How do we explain nothing? If I say even this, there is space, haven't I just posited a false notion? I say there is something, but what I'm saying is there is nothing. There's no there, and there's nothing there in there. If you read ancient philosophers, they have a really hard time talking about the idea of space or void, absolute vacuousness. But this is an important theory for Epicurus and others, because if you have atoms, but you don't have void, then you have maybe a solid mass. You have a solid mass, you have nothing of a different sort. All right, you have infinite everything all packed together. Nope. So Epicurus is going to posit there are atoms and there are void. But then we need something else. We need motion. Now, most of us were raised on the idea of a universe that's expanding. All right, like there was a Big Bang, and the universe is still expanding. So when we think of motion in the universe in space, we think of kind of like there's a central part, and then it's expanding like this. That's not how Epicurus understood it. He understood there was atomic motion, but he thought it was like this. The universe is infinite. There's no top, there's no bottom, there's no sides. And he says that at least primally, atoms fell like raindrops downward. But if you think about it, if there's no down in an infinite universe, it doesn't really make sense to say down. All right. Now, if that's a primal motion, there's something else that happens, because if all the atoms just fall down at an equal speed, they're never going to bump into each other. If they can't bump, they can't cohere. And if we can't get molecules, we certainly can't get planets. And so there needed to be another step. And this is a huge step forward in scientific thinking. Epicurus posited that there was a thing he called the swerve. All right, now what's the swerve? The swerve, and this is all still controversial interpreting it. The person that I studied under at University of Chicago, she would probably disagree with me on this, and I disagree with others, but it's something like this. These atoms, as they're falling through space, they go boop, like that, or maybe they go boop, and they go in a different direction. Just the tiniest little switch of motion, all right? But even if one of those swerves, one atom, all it takes is one, because if it hits another, it can bounce, and that can hit something, and that can hit something, and it becomes a universal chain reaction of motion. And so even if the atoms were primevally falling like this, all it takes is one to swerve, and all of a sudden the universe is chaotic and things are bouncing around. And that's crucial for anything to come to be.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Does that swerve occur without any apparent design or cause?
Yes.
Of its own accord?
Of its own accord, but even that's like our language fails us here, right? Because then we impute some sort of agency to the atom. It just occurs. Yeah, there's no design here. There's no purpose to this universe. That we'll get to that in a moment here, more with ethics. But yes, these things just happen. Now, if that seems a little strange to you, it's not too far distant from what we can't really observe, but we can theorize about quantum physics. All right. These days, we know that electrons are somewhere in an atom, but it's really actually hard to pin them down where they are. They move. All right. If we think of electrons as a particle, or maybe they're more like a wave, and so they're constantly in motion. These little electrons, they can actually shift away. They can be stripped away from an atom. So if you think of atomic motion and its unpredictability, we actually kind of understand that today of a different sort. Some of you are familiar with like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, or the idea that when you try to observe an electron, the very fact of observing it makes it not there. It's always where you aren't observing it. There's unpredictability in quantum physics. Okay, so these things come together, all right? Well, if we have molecules can become bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, we're going to get masses the size of worlds or solar systems. And if there can be solar systems and worlds, there can be other things that come to be. And eventually, we come to be. Now, the other side of this is that everything that can come to be can also disintegrate. And so for Epicurus, death is unavoidable and inevitable. Everything that has come to be will disintegrate, dissolve, mind, body, and soul. All right. So there is no afterlife. There is no pre-life. There's just life. And then that's it. You can see how some people are going to automatically, like, it makes us feel weird inside. Yeah, Nathan, did you have a
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, does the constitution of a human being, with all of the complexity of what that entails, does it kind of reconstitute itself in any other intelligent form? Does he theorize?
He does. In fact, we don't have that in so much in Epicurus, but we have it in Lucretius. Lucretius, I'll talk about him in a moment. But yes, he said that absolutely, it's actually mathematically guaranteed in an infinite universe on an infinite scale of time. Every single one of your atoms is going to recombine, and there will be you, exactly you again. It's mathematically guaranteed in an infinite time scale. But he says it won't be you as you know you, because the memory's been broken. And so you will live again, but you won't be you. And this is a weird thing. So people have, even in antiquity were like, so I'll live again, and that shall be comforted. And Epicurus would say, no, you're not going to be there to observe yourself. And no, it's not going to be you as you know yourself. So Derek is asking, was this idea of going to nothing big at the time just because it was different than Plato? Well, yes, I think so, and no. One thing about Plato is, in the modern world, we actually give Plato way more attention than he garnered in the ancient world. Plato was kind of always on the outside looking outward. He was not of mainstream philosophers. And so in some ways, yes, Epicurus is pushing back against Plato. And here Plato thinking that there was a pre-existence of soul and that there is some sort of post-existence. But things get really weird with Plato because, like, you become a star and you exist in the heavens as, like, your soul melds with the star. It's all quite strange. But he was thinking of a material existence, like after death on this world. So yeah, I think Epicurus is pushing back against that. There is a fantastic book called Creationism and Its Critics in Antiquity. If you're interested in this, Derek, Creationism and Its Critics in Antiquity. Noni asks, where do these atoms fall from? Can they also move upward due to the swerve? So there is no source for the atoms. I know it's hard for us to think about this because we're so used to the Big Bang Theory, where there was a super compacted, dense core that then blew up and expanded. These atoms just are. And the word fall, I mean, it's just this inapproximate language we're using. They're just in motion in space. And if we think of them falling again, that's kind of the primal theorized motion. But as soon as they swerve, then they're moving all sorts of directions. So it's more like a model in our minds to think of like, how did this begin? But there was no beginning, not for Epicurus. Things just always have been. These are great questions, by the way. Okay, so we have infinite universe. We have infinite time. We have infinite number of atoms. We have a finite set of atoms. We come to be, we exist, and we die. Well, anytime we start talking about death, this is the moment we talk about ethics. What do you do in the meantime? What do you do with your very brief time here? Noni, that's a great question. Lucretius seems to pause at the beginning at his poem. Yes, let me come to that in a moment here. So what do we do in our very brief time? Well, seek pleasure. That's the basic answer Epicurus is going to give. Seek pleasure. But this has caused a great deal of misunderstanding about what Epicureanism is and isn't. There's the cartoonish version of the Epicure. The cartoonish version is a guy who drinks a bunch of wine and eats grapes and figs and honey treats. And he says things like, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we're dead and it's all over, so let's just enjoy it all. Epicurus would say, yeah, that's actually true. But you don't need grapes and figs, you don't need treats, and you don't need good wine. You can do this with bread and water, because if you drink enough water, you're satisfied. If you eat enough bread, you're satisfied. He has nothing against figs and wine. It's just that you don't need these things. This pleasure thing, well, it's a very restricted sort of pleasure. Epicureans were all about what we now call a pleasure calculus. They absolutely seek pleasure, but not every pleasure is to be pursued. Not every pain is to be avoided. If you think about it, it's actually almost impossible or really difficult to think of a system of ethics, choices, and avoidances that's not based on a pleasure principle. Like, how do you choose anything? Isn't it always for some reward or to avoid some sort of pain? Epicurus made what came to be called the Cradle Argument. He says the most basic thing that all humans do when they're born is they cry. They cry because they're hungry and they're in pain. And what they're all seeking for is to be nursed by their mother. And that alleviates the pain and it brings them comfort. Our very first impulse is to alleviate our pain. Well, that all sounds quite selfish, and it is. Epicurean ethics, based upon pleasure, is first and foremost self-serving. But it's not utterly self-interested. There is other interest. In fact, that's a really important key to Epicureanism, is it draws you outside of yourself. And so once you care for yourself, you realize that yourself is going to be put in danger to the outside world unless you care for others. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I wanted to address these questions. So back to what Noni asked, Lucretius seems to pause at the beginning in his poem. Yes, Lucretius does all sorts of weird things that actually seem rather non-Epicurean. Like he opens it talking about Venus and stuff. He doesn't even believe in Venus. And he talks about it almost seems like a biblical creation narrative. The first 25 lines feel really like Genesis, first couple chapters of Genesis. He is making some poetic maneuvers. All right, he's using familiar language. He's setting themes that kind of transcend human culture. But what he's not doing is he's not making strong assertions there. He's making sweet overtures to an audience that might be resistant. But no, Lucretius absolutely would not say that there's a beginning. But he's got to start somewhere to get you invested. Let me get some of the other questions. Nathan asked, does this pleasure criterion require discipline and work to achieve instead of just slotting down to the common denominator of comfort? Absolutely. In fact, Epicureans were kind of the real ones, were famously self-disciplined. And they had really harsh words for people who pursued sexual gratification rampantly, who pursued power, who pursued wealth. Nope, they were not about that. They wanted to live quietly. They wanted to live with the least amount of means that they needed. And hey, if something good comes along, they're not going to reject that. They'll accept it, but they need to be able to live without it. This idea of self-sufficiency in the world, being okay with a little, this is the key for Epicurean pleasure calculus. And the reason you don't pursue all those high pleasures, constant ones, is because they're dangerous. The more pleasures you pursue, the more things you take from others. And the more you take from others, the more vendettas you bring upon yourself. You will have much fewer enemies if you live quietly. Okay, so let me get some of the other ones. Okay, so Derek says this could be a whole other topic, but did Epicurus have political ideas based on his ethical ideas? Yes, there is an entire field of research on this. Epicurean politics. Epicureans they did their best as social parasites. Now that sounds like something really cool to say about a group. I mean this in a neutral sense. Epicureans were not state builders. This just wasn't in their program. They liked states that existed that were stable, because within a stable state, you could pursue philosophy and community building and empirical research and showing others ways to happiness. They did not really think about creating an Epicurean state. Over against, say, Plato, who fantasized constantly about creating a perfect Platonic state. And you can read all about that in Plato's Republic. Okay, Noni says, Epicurus doesn't directly posit a swerve either, right? That is correct. That's correct insofar as we're victims of our sources. We're pretty sure that Epicurus did talk about the swerve because Lucretius does. And Lucretius is like the most dedicated student of a group that there ever was. And so most people, and I include myself in this camp, I'm pretty sure that Epicurus also had swerve. Otherwise, his system doesn't quite work. If you have atoms only falling, then they don't make contact. Okay, but let me go back to the sources thing. Epicurus was a voluminous author. He wrote literally hundreds of books. When I say books, I mean books in the ancient world. They could be small, like scrolls, or they could be multi-volume, but he wrote a lot. We have the titles of tons of these that still exist, but the documents themselves are far gone. Of all the hundreds and hundreds of things that he published, all that's left from antiquity are 3 letters he wrote to students and a series of sayings that were remembered. And so we are tragically just never going to recover probably anything more from Epicurus. But at least he wrote stuff down. You know, other famous social reformers from the ancient world, they chose not to write. Perhaps this is a tie for being most famous. Most famously, 1 and 2 were A and 1. Socrates never wrote anything down, and Jesus didn't either. And so we're dependent upon their followers. Okay, so Brian asks, seek pleasure in a quiet life, and one day, let's see, that me is not going to reconstitute itself, but not in the heart of a star. Yeah, you pretty much got it. Live quietly, seek pleasure, disciplined pleasures, and one day you are coming back, but you'll have no recollection of your former self, so you won't be you, and it won't matter to you at all. All right, let me get back to ethics a little bit. So in this life of pleasure, how do we discipline ourselves? Like, what's the point of it all? Why don't we all just become monsters of consumption and just take and take and take? The answer is not easy. And Epicurus holds himself to a high standard, but he's quite understanding of others who can't quite accomplish this. It's something that's learned over time. And he understands that it's really difficult in youth to do this. And some of his sayings that survive are our understanding of young people trying to come to terms with being bodies, all right? There's sexual desires, there's desires to be famous, there's desires to be wealthy. He understands that. This is not something you achieve in your teens or your 20s. It's something you pursue. But it's not like it's a distant goal that no one can reach. No, Epicurus is quite optimistic about our ability to become become wise. And it's in our lifetimes. And happiness and this freedom from all these anxieties, it can be achieved in a human lifetime. Nani says, not pursuing certain pleasures because they can harm others so that you don't gain more enemies still seems like a self-motivated interest or self-interested motive. Yeah, it is, absolutely. But as we think more about this, I don't know that anyone really posits absolute, radical, strict altruism. A radical, strict altruism would be like the equivalent of the sun and its rays. Now, it's nice to be warmed by those rays, but you have no relationship with the sun, right? The sun just gives off heat. That's all it can be to us here. Strict altruism would be just utterly giving with no sort of interaction. There's no need on the other person's part. So I think for Epicurus, self-interest is not a vice. Self-interest is a reality, but that self-interest drives you outward to others. And he's, again, quite humane. He says things like, it's painful for him to watch a friend be tortured as though it would be to be tortured oneself. And he even goes so far as to say something quite Christian sounding. And he says, it's even proper for someone to die for somebody else. And the pleasure calculus there, again, it's difficult. If you love somebody so much that their suffering and death gives you greater pain in life than your own death would be, then your death is the preferable pleasure. And it's a kind of a weird way to think about it, but you will accept that pain to achieve the greater pleasure. And the greater pleasure is to see your friends not in pain, or to succeed, or to be happy. Yeah. Okay.
I was going to say, Mike, what I like about this is how Epicurus does not have some kind of inflexible, rigid, list of qualifications that makes something pleasure or makes something not pleasure. He kind of leaves it up to the judgment of the individual, right?
Yes.
Based on circumstance.
It is. These pleasures and pains are based on circumstance. Absolutely. And where a right action in one situation might be considered a wrong action in another situation. Does this make him a moral relativist? Yes, it absolutely does. Morality is relative to the time and the culture and the circumstances. Of course, Platonists are going to hate him for this because in Platonism, there's an idea that there is an infinite moral rightness, and that a good life is to align oneself with that and to live justly. And the only way that you're going to succeed through courses of multiple lifetimes for strict Platonists is to live more and more justly until you achieve this ideal form of justice, and then you become something else. Okay, so let me transition and talk about Lucretius for a moment, and then we can just have open discussion. Lucretius was not an eyewitness to Epicurus, all right? He lived a couple hundred years later, and he lived in a very different time and culture. He was a Roman. Lucretius was like a Roman. His name is like from the oldest Roman family history books. Maybe some of you know the myth of Lucretia. Well, anyway, this is the founding myth of Rome. Lucretia was sexually assaulted by somebody, and this caused a rift, and then there was a war, and the Romans threw out some kings and established what came to be the Republic. But Lucretia is just the feminine name of Lucretius, and so this family goes way back. We don't know a lot about Lucretius's biography, like almost nothing. We know that he had a friend or mentor or patron who was a pretty high political figure at Rome. And his name alone tells us that he's from this family. We know that he was highly educated because you can't produce a poem like this that's also philosophy without years of training and practice. We know his time. He was born about the same year as Julius Caesar, and he died younger than Caesar by about a decade. So he died around 55 BCE. Now that date won't mean a whole lot to many of you, but that's a pretty critical date in Roman history. Lucretius is writing his poem as Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus are gathering power at Rome. This is the triumvirate. You've heard of the triumvirate, perhaps. This is when the Roman Republic is kind of starting to falter. 55 is the year that Caesar gets more or less an illegal grant to go fight a war in modern day France and kill tons of Gauls, like millions of Gauls. Lucretius is writing in this moment, and he's specifically writing to educated, powerful Roman men. And what he is trying to convince them of is that everything they're doing right now is dangerous and wrong, and it's going to hurt themselves. It's going to hurt the Republic. He's trying to convert them to Epicureanism, but that's a really hard sell. Because remember, Epicureanism is about living quietly, living with little, not pursuing wealth and power and domination through war, not pursuing domineering sexuality. It was a really tough sell. His approach is interesting. He writes a poem. I don't know how effective poetry is in changing people's minds. I know I feel poetry quite deeply, but it seems if it actually changed people's minds, more people would, be doing it. But he writes this poem, and the genre he picks is really weird. He chooses epic. Epic is the genre of war. This is the Iliad, Achilles being mad and killing tons of people. He writes an epic, and there's the choice is probably, on purpose. It seems that he's trying to rewrite an epic for Roman men. Like, this is what it means to be a hero. This is what it means to be manly in the world. And everything that you think about this is wrong. Let me blow up the world. Okay. I'm going to close with this portion just by reading you the first few lines of the poem in meter. So you can actually hear it in Latin and also as poetic meter. I know most of you don't know Latin, but to me, it's just infinitely beautiful. And I just like, people to hear it. So here we go. Aine adun genitrix hominum di womque voluptas, alma venus caeli subter la ventia signa, quae marinae garumque terras fru differentis, concerbas per te quoniam genus omnanimantum, concipitur visitque exortum lumina solis. All right, so that's the first 5 or 6 lines in Latin. What I just read to you was an opening of gorgeous, luscious biological life. It's seas teeming with life. It's birds singing at dawn. It's winds blowing. It's animals coming together to propagate their species. The opening of the poem is one that celebrates biological fecundity, because without that, none of us exist. And it's a very beautiful and happy opening. The ending of the poem, as far as we have, is kind of rough. It ends with a pandemic where people are just piling up bodies and they're running out of resources and they're fighting over wood to burn corpses. It's a pretty dismal ending. Okay, I could say more, but I think we should just move on to Q&A now.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. That's a great way to get this conversation going even further. I have a question, and then we can just open up to everyone else for questions. So one thing I really appreciate about Lucretius is that he acknowledges the complexity, the diversity, the multiplicity of not only human life, but just the individual. And I see there a little bit of tension with the way that the good is simplified down to pleasure, because one thing that the Greeks paid attention to is giving all sides of the human life. It's giving all sides of human life their due. They're honoring their purview. But one thing that Lucretius doesn't seem to do is to honor the other dimensions of life, which are ambition, adventure, achievement, suffering, the growth that can come from suffering. And so if you live just a life seeking pleasure, that doesn't seem like a life of growth. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Lucretius, as I said, is fully a Roman man, and he actually glories in his achievements. He can't help but do so. He says that this effort that he's made to turn a Greek philosophy into a Latin idea fit for Roman aristocratic men was a huge labor, and he's really proud of it. And he says, I deserve a crown of achievement for this. In fact, I'm the only one who's ever done this, and nobody's done it as good as me, or as well as I have. So he is all about effort. And there is a sense of suffering for growth. The way when he praises Epicurus toward the beginning of the poem, he doesn't describe him as a nerdy intellect or some like hippie commune, peace, love, and happiness kind of guy. Nope. The language he uses is actually stripped directly from Roman politics. He is a conqueror who looks up at the heavens. He goes out in his mind and he conquers them and leaves the wreckage burning like a conquered city behind him. He uses the language of adventure and aggression. So he does understand that. He also understands that advancement, progress in human life does come with striving, and he doesn't dismiss progress. He's not a Luddite, all right? He doesn't think that striving to make life better or more interesting that's wrong. No, not at all. It's just that if one gets caught up in that, and that becomes one's sole purpose, or if one starts to enact violence against others, that's where he would have a problem with it. I can actually read you a quote here. So this is a saying of Epicurus that survived. He says, since the attainment of great wealth can scarcely be accomplished without slavery to crowds or to politicians, a free life cannot obtain much wealth. But such a life already possesses everything in unfailing supply. All right, so that's the standard Epicurean thing. Then he says, but should a life happen to achieve great wealth, this too it can share so as to gain the goodwill of one's neighbors. So striving, betterment, achievement of power and wealth, this too can fit into the system so long as one then makes others' lives better. But the self-interest, you make their lives better because we all know that revolutions are around the corner when one or two people take all the wealth and all the power to themselves. That's the recipe to bring harm upon yourself. So out of self-interest, you share with others. Okay, let me get some other questions here. Tim asks, it's said that Lucretius is not religious, yet he seems to believe in gods, i.e. Venus. How is this explained? Yeah, man, this is one of the great questions about Lucretius. Epicurus too believed in gods, but people questioned it from early on because, famously Socrates was killed because he was teaching against the established gods of the state of Athens. Now, was Epicurus an atheist? Lucretius an atheist? If we take them at their word, they're not. But their gods are quite different. They definitely don't believe in state gods. So no Venus, no Zeus, no Aphrodite, none of that. Did they believe in a pre-Christian idea of a god, like a monotheistic creator, designer? Nope, absolutely not. Their gods, so far as we can understand them, and they talk about them openly, is that these gods live perfectly blessed lives somewhere out in space, somewhere in the universe. There are these perfectly blessed figures. They're not anxious. They're not sad. They don't over pursue pleasure. They don't experience pain. They live perfectly blessed, fortunate, happy lives, and they have nothing to do with us. They are never going to be entreaty. They're never going to be changed by our entreaties. They're never going to punish us. They have absolutely nothing to do with us. Well, of course, people are like, well, then what's the point of those gods? What do they do? And Lucretius and Epicurus would answer, they are paragons. They are our exemplars. We can live like the gods here and now. We can be happy right now, but we have to do it on our own. Self-sufficiency. The gods aren't going to do anything for us. Okay, let me get some other points here. All right, let's see if Jeffrey wants to point out. One topic that Lucretius introduced in book 2 on the nature of things is that swerve of atoms enables human free will. Yes, let's talk about this. Okay, so going back to these atoms, all right, they're moving around and they can move just at random. Now, let's talk about the composition of human body. So Epicurus and Lucretius are going to suggest that there is a body, all right, body we can see. Then there's something like that they would call the spirit, all right? The spirit would be something like our brain and nervous system. So a seat of intellectual thought that then is able to move out throughout the body to move our muscles and make us do things. But then further back than that is the mind, all right? Or maybe sometimes it's called the soul. The language is a bit squishy. But Lucretius says that beyond that, in that realm of thinking, it reside the most delicate and refined of atoms. They're super smooth. They're the tiniest of all. And because they can move just on their own, that breaks the chains of fate. That means you're not being controlled by anything. Now, fate was a big deal in the ancient world. And still today, it's kind of hard to think of a sense of radical free will. Geography and DNA determine so much of how we experience life. I don't think Lucretius would disagree or Epicurus would disagree, but they do argue that because atoms are not chained to any sort of predetermined end, that guarantees us free will. Now, you're thinking, okay, how does that work? They can't explain it either. In fact, Lucretius eventually just punts, and he's like, okay, look, it's like a black box. There are atoms in there, they're doing things, and because they're not being controlled, that gives us free will. Again, not fully satisfactory, but it helps us get a little closer. If you asked neuroscientists and psychiatrists, psychologists, and modern day philosophers, how is it that we generate a thought? Most of them are going to, if they're honest, they're going to say we actually don't know that. And so again, it's kind of a punting, and there's a black box there. Okay, am I misreading free will as being the same as human agency? No, they're the same. You are guaranteed by physics to have free will. You are guaranteed to be able to do really whatever you want. And now, of course, there are some natural laws. Not that some creator has imposed those, but just you can't do certain things. You can't contravene the law of gravity. Okay, great questions.
Okay, let me ask another question. What does Lucretius mean by religion?
Yeah,
religion haunts this book.
Religion, yes, it haunts this poem. And yet, Epicurus says, I'm quoting him directly here. Epicurus says, the wise man will set up votive offerings to the gods. Like in your house, you will have a little section, a little shrine to the gods. All right, so how does this all work? Well, there's religion and there's religion. The word that Lucretius uses is religio, religion. He's probably thinking something closer to what we might say like superstition. He uses the word religio because there's certain linguistic ties, and it fits the scheme, the metrical scheme of the poem well. What does he mean by this? Well, for one, it would mean state religion. That's his major target. He is intimately aware of the fear that religion engenders in people's souls and minds. Your standard Roman at the time, did they believe in a sort of negative afterlife? Maybe. But they at least feared death, or they were uncertain about death. Fears of death are what drive, this is Lucretius, I'm putting words in his mouth. Fear of death is what drives superstitious thinking. And it drives us into pretty dark paths. We start to think that maybe we can stave off divine wrath or death if we start making sacrifices. Maybe we can curry divine favor if we start making sacrifices. And these sacrifices can get out of hand. And one of the most disturbing and moving portions of the poem occurs within the first 150 lines. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase it here. He says, now, student that I'm writing to, I understand that if you embark on the path of philosophy, there are going to be people in your lives that are going to say, hey, that's the path of crime. Every philosophy student who goes to college gets a similar spiel from their parents. Don't study philosophy. He says, not so. It's actually religion that has the power for crime. And he gives the example from the Iliad, or from myth. And he says, Agamemnon, as he was leading all those Greek soldiers over to Troy, he said that he led his daughter to to what she thought was a marriage altar. And instead of marrying her to somebody, and she's all dressed up for her wedding day, instead they kill her on the altar, because this is what they thought the gods wanted in order to ensure that the fleet could sail across the sea and invade Troy. So great the power of religion that you would engage in human sacrifice to go and then conquer another people. All sorts of messed up. So for him, bad religion is founded upon fear. Better religion, or good religion, is founded on not fear. You don't fear the gods that exist somewhere in space because they can't do anything for you or against you. You're just inspired by their blessedness. Okay, let me get some Christians' comment here. Whenever I hear a modern talk about Epicurean ethics, they seem really attracted, really positive about it. Maybe confirmation bias. Would you comment on how Epicurean ethics fit into the range of 20th century, 21st century ideas? It's a great question. So, I'm going to speak from rather personally here. When I first became interested in Hellenistic philosophy and ethics, I was actually most attracted to Stoicism. And I was knee deep in graduate school. Life gets pretty dark when you're in graduate school. It's a long road. It took me 9 years from master's and PhD combined. And it's just a grind. And Stoicism provided a way for me to think through about just like endurance and grinding through years of what felt like fruitless labors. Epicureanism was always there too, and I studied it as well. And it seemed kind of, I don't know, kind of weak to me because I didn't give much credence. But upon reconsidering it later, I realized that Stoicism was great as a way to move through hard things. But it didn't allow me personally a way to think about flourishing, about being happy, about not just like powering through anxieties and pain, but seeing them in a different light. And so Epicureanism is quite positive for a lot of people. A lot of people respond really well to it. My first introduction to it was I was an undergraduate, and a guest scholar from the University of Texas came, and he delivered a paper on Epicurean friendship. And I remember being like, wow, that sounds really attractive, but it just wasn't the right time. Turns out for me, I became more attracted to this in my mid-30s. Now, okay, so that's speaking to me personally. Is it confirmation bias? Yes, it absolutely is. It's really hard to study anything for a prolonged period of time without either developing an affinity for it or the opposite, like an antipathy towards it. And maybe it's just because the way I'm wired, I have a really hard time devoting too much of my life to things that drive me crazy. This is why when I first went to graduate school, I was going to write a dissertation on Plato and all the things I was talking about earlier, but I just couldn't handle it. I just got tired of Plato. But I've been able to spend years of my life doing Epicureanism because it seems to fit better for me personally. For the range of 20th century and 21st century ideas, yeah, I'm massaging and giving you guys a version of Epicureanism that works. There are lots of criticisms to be made of the system. For one, its science was just bad. Nobody studies Epicureanism science or Epicurus' science in the 21st century to learn anything. No, that's a fool's errand. It's more like an orientation to live in a scientifically minded world. It's a way to think about a world that you can't control in a universe that's, for us, functionally infinite. And it's a way to eke out satisfaction and happiness. But it's not perfect. And we could just start rattling off the ways that it's insufficient. Like the fact that, does this really work? Well, I've yet to see it work in any other than individual bases. I've never seen a community of Epicureans. I don't think I'd really want to. One thing I found out about real life is that when you see yourself replicated or things that you really like in big numbers, it's kind of off-putting. Like the first few times I went to an academic conference and there were tons and tons of other tweed-dressed academics, I realized that I wouldn't want to see myself replicated the world over. And so I probably feel the same about Epicureans. I think that the most important thing that Epicurus or Lucretius has to say today is actually the way that we interact with each other. It's their argument for inevitable human intimacy. All right, so let me backtrack just a second for that. So this is a fully materialistic system. There's nothing, and then there's things. So anything that we experience is going to be a thing. This comes down to sense perceptions. So when I look at something, when I'm looking at my hand right there, in the ancient world, kind of the basic idea was that my eyes, when I open them, they reach out and they physically like touch my hand and then bring back information into my head, and then I can compute it. That's called haptic site or touching sight. Epicurus didn't really believe in that. He was like, no, it's actually just the opposite. Anything that exists is made of atoms, and atoms are constantly like shearing off of an object and moving through air and space and striking our senses. So when I see you, I'm actually physically taking part of you in, like little bits of atoms from you. Now that might sound weird for us for sight, but we understand the basics of like photons, light photons bouncing off of a thing and then hitting our eyes and creating sight. For us, it works better with smell. It's a bit awkward to say, but like every smell is particulate. So if I'm near you and I smell anything about you, a part of you is physically entering me, and I have you inside me. This is a radically intimate system of interaction. And so what I think speaks most to me in the 21st century is that I am not sanctioned off from anybody else. To interact with anybody on any level, from sight toward the more intimate, is to create an interaction. And that, for me, seems like if it's going to be an interaction, it should be mutually beneficial, and it should be something that builds rather than creates enemies. Okay. Are there other questions that I'm missing here?
Yeah, there's one question from Jeffrey.
Oh, yeah, I see it now. Okay, good. Also, book 2, Lucretius comments on light and color. In Lucretius's world, is light itself made of atoms? Yes. All right. Now, he doesn't understand photons. No, it's not like that. It's that any source of light, be it a candle or the sun, is emitting atoms. He doesn't have a wave theory. Okay. So the atoms are moving kind of in a straight line, and they're striking us. Atoms themselves do not have color, and Lucretius is very specific about this. So is Epicurus. But that is a contingent property. So when light hits something just the right way, it can create that color. But we don't say that the colors themselves, or that the atoms themselves have intrinsic color to them. And he gives it multiple examples. Like if you have an awning and the sun's shining on it, that creates a certain color. But as the sun moves, the awning changes colors. It's because it's the way the light's hitting it that gives it color. Okay, I'm happy to keep going if there are more questions, but if people are ready to check out, I fully understand.
Well, we can go for about maybe 5 minutes or so, but you mentioned how the science of Epicureanism is just bad. But did it set in place some of the building blocks upon which further science, more precise science, could be built? Necessary blocks.
Yes. So the survival of the idea of atoms, the idea survives. It never goes away, even through what we call, quote unquote, the Dark Ages. There were people who were definitely aware of the theory of atoms. When Lucretius's poem was discovered, and this is an interesting story, I'm going to give you like the 30-second version of it. Because of the rise of Christianity, I'm not going to blame Christians here, but because of the rise of Christianity, Epicureanism, among a great other number of ancient ideas, was kind of stamped out. And Lucretius's poem, this is kind of crazy to think about. A full manuscript of the poem really only survives with one actual manuscript. And we came within one fire in a monastery, or one like flood, or one really hungry rat or something, from losing this poem in its entirety. Now, would have modernity come into being without this? Of course it would have. But we can actually trace the rediscovery of Lucretius's poem to some pretty important scientific thinking. This poem is rediscovered in the 1400s. It's propagated, it's copied, and it goes out. and people started to read it. You know, some people actually paid with their lives. The Catholic Church wasn't super fond of this poem, you can imagine. And some people, yeah, they died for it. But this poem gets read, and it's so beautiful, and it's so kind of like disarmingly beautiful that people want to read more of it. But the ideas start to percolate. And the idea of atoms and a universe that is observable. Yes, we can see the pre-modern scientific like flourishing happening, not directly because of the poem, but in conversation with it, and definitely inspired a lot of people. We know that Newton loved the poem, had multiple copies of it, and even goes so far as like Thomas Jefferson was like a mega fan of Lucretius and owned like 5 copies in Latin and translations in German and French. He may have had as many copies of that as Bibles where he cut out the word God and stuff, but you know, he was a weird guy. So yes, we can trace modern thinking to the finding this poem again. Jeffrey asked another question. Lucretius comments on some pre-Socratic philosophers such as Heraclitus, Empedocles, etc. Why did he not comment on Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle? Yes, such a great question. He not just comments on, he's kind of snotty about it too. Epicureans were famous for being rather dismissive of other philosophers because they were so convinced that this was the way to happiness. All right, it's not unlike people who are convinced that their religion is correct. They can often be dismissive of others. But why does he not mention Socrates or Plato? Well, probably the whole poem is a conversation and an argument against Socrates and Plato, and so he doesn't really feel like he needs to name them. And also, again, it's just hard for us to comprehend, but Plato just wasn't a big name on the scene, especially at Rome. People at Rome weren't so interested in Plato's theoretical ideas. They weren't. They were interested in Aristotle, yes, because Aristotle did empirical research and taxonomy and trying to explain like, why does this animal breed so well? And why does this plant not reproduce so well? They were interested in Stoicism. Stoicism gave kind of aligned with some patriotic Roman ideals in some way. Plato definitely was on the mind of Lucretius and Epicurus, but again, in some ways, he wasn't a major conversation partner with them. It's a great question. So Amanda asks, over recent years, Stoicism has gained popularity in mainstream culture. Do you expect the study of Lucretius to gain popularity? Why or why not? Oh, that's a good question. I would say that Stoicism has gained popularity because it appeals to, I'm going to say, come right out and say it, it appeals to a certain type of masculinity. The kind that likes to think of itself as hardcore and enduring and strong and is able to like, bootstrap and all that. That's kind of a bastardization of Stoic ethics, but it's a popular one, both anciently and in modern times. It's been fascinating me as someone who works on Stoicism to see in the last 15 years that Stoicism is not just mainstream. It's like there are YouTube channels about Stoicism. There are popular books. I saw a guy wearing a shirt that had like a Stoic saying on it from Marcus Aurelius. It's quite normal now. I don't know. I don't see it happening with Lucretius and Epicureanism. Generally speaking, people who consume, the goods that society produce aren't as interested in people who argue against the consumption of goods. Like there's a bit of a disjuncture there. Quick fun fact: you guys know Karl Marx, right? The guy who people either love or hate or don't really care about, but you know who Karl Marx is. He actually wrote his dissertation on Epicurus. He was a classicist before he became a political theorist, and was quite interested, not in Lucretius, but Epicurus. It was because he was interested in materialism, which of course gave rise to all sorts of things later. Do I find today's pop Stoicism to be a bastardization of Stoic philosophy? Kind of yes, but I'm of the sort that if it inspires any interest in the ancient world, I'm cool with that. I myself would probably prefer a little less of the popularization, but again, I don't know. I like when anybody's interested in ancient things. And I think a whole lot of people need to think ethically in a philosophical way these days people are unmoored now too, is maybe more than people ever have been. And so if people can find some sort of way to think through life and to think about what is morality based upon and how to make better choices, if Stoicism fills that gap for people and helps them, I'm all about it. Certainly, it was beneficial to me at a period of time in my life. Am I missing some? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, a couple of questions come in.
Is there a particular English translation on the nature of things you'd recommend? Yes, I'll hold one up. If you want a really beautiful translation, this is Anthony Esolen. All right, Anthony Esolen's translation. This is Johns Hopkins University Press. Let me get one more. I should be getting royalties at this point. I teach this one to students, hundreds every year. So this is Ronald Melville's On the Nature of the Universe. This is Oxford University Press. I use this one with my undergrad students. It's a bit more literal. They tend to understand it a little bit better. They can both be had for cheap. I don't recommend, there's one by someone named Stallings, A.E. Stallings. It's a bit strange. It's a beautiful thing, but I don't recommend it for those who want to like really understand what Lucretius is saying. Okay. Peter wants to know, what is my opinion of the book, The Swerve? Your account seems to agree with some claims in the book, but others have criticized it as kind of overstuffed, claiming too much for Lucretius. Yeah, I would agree. I have my copy of The Swerve somewhere. Okay, so I do recommend it. This is The Swerve. As you can see, it was a National Book Award winner and Pulitzer Prize winner. This thing sold tons of stuff. He made money on it. I probably never will on my work on Lucretius, but Greenblatt oversimplifies a lot of things. He oversimplifies Epicureanism, and he's reading it through a very certain lens. He's reading it through his own personal lens of kind of a loss of personal faith, and then looking for something to fill that in. And he has a very moving story about how he encountered this book, this poem, like at a used bookstore, and he just picked it up and he started reading, and it was like overwhelming to him. And so I find that interesting and compelling. He probably does a disservice to the Middle Ages, and he probably does a disservice to actual Epicurean philosophy at points. But he tells a really engaging story about the rediscovery of the text. And it's so readable and so fun that it's literally a page turner. If you start reading it, you'll be drawn in. He's a fantastic writer, and he's a legit scholar in his own field, which is early modernism. That's how he kind of came to this.
Well, let me ask the last question, and it goes back to what you said in the beginning about how strange it is for us to, in modern life, under kind of a Christian assumption, is that we thinking of life without an afterlife is kind of strange for us. We're kind of conditioned in some ways to think of that way. Do you think that relying on an afterlife can kind of stunt an ethical life, can kind of stunt ethical deliberation? That makes sense.
Are you probably asking me personally, or should I put on my Epicurean mask here?
Either one.
Okay. Well, I'm a pretty devout Epicurean. I think for me, the idea of a pleasure-based system and hedonic calculus, that works for me. So speaking personally, I'm not sure that the idea of an afterlife undercuts or cheapens or somehow vitiates human experience. That doesn't feel quite right to me. I think that it can devalue actual morality in the moment. If your morality is deferred for some future point where you're no longer really responsible, you're not really here, that feels like that can trend towards something that is kind of selfish in a different way, selfish in a non-useful way. The idea of an afterlife that induces fear, I think that's probably, for me, that feels more of a negative, of a net negative. I have yet to encounter someone who makes fear-based decisions, who I feel like I can connect with. People who make fear-based decisions. I don't know how to quite say this. I feel like I'm not taken into their calculus, and they'll make a decision to alleviate their anxiety, no matter who they have to like burn or maybe hurt a little bit to get to that point. And that to me can trend a little dangerous.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we should end there. Just want to say, we appreciate you coming. This is a rich discussion about just one school of ethics in the ancient world that I think is very relevant for a modern world. And we're very looking forward to your book coming out.
Thanks. At some point, who knows?
Yeah, that sounds very relevant as well. So thanks again, and we'd like to have you back, and we'll see you next time, hopefully.
Thanks so much. It was really great to see people I haven't seen actually in years show up for this, and other people that I now get to know a little bit. Thanks for the invitation, and if anyone has any questions, you can find me online easily. Send me an email. I'll send you, answer questions, or we can have a discussion via Zoom, whatever you want to do. Okay. Thanks again. All right, guys, I'm going to sign off.
Thanks. See ya.